Hello and welcome to our midweek Bible study for April 29th, 2020. We will begin at the verse 1 of Acts chapter 14. And remember, we are looking at Paul and Barnabas as they continue on Paul's first missionary journey. So we began in Antioch of Syria. We traveled across the Mediterranean to the island nation of Cyprus, made our way across to the western coastline. Then we sailed with Paul and Barnabas to Perga of Pamphylia. And then we ended in Antioch in Pisidia. Now, here is where we left off last week in Acts chapter 13, and Paul and Barnabas were expelled from the synagogue. And remember that Jewish tradition we talked about, that on the Sabbath there would be a reading of the law, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, of the prophets, and then there would be an invitation of any learned man to speak. And so it was their pattern that they would go into the synagogue on the Sabbath and they would speak, and many converts were made that way. But eventually, the non believing Jews drove them out. And so today in chapter 14, we're looking at the travel to an inland, mainland area, a city known as Iconium, and then moving to Lystra and Derbe before going back and repeating some of these cities and going back to Syrian Antioch. Now, I mentioned that idea of pattern. The pattern of behavior of Paul on his missions was to go into the synagogue on the Sabbath. You'll recall that was Jesus's pattern as well as he was engaging in his earthly ministry. There's also going to be a pattern of initial reception, both by Jews and Gentiles, and then eventually a rejection of the non-believing Jews. And so we're going to see that pattern repeated over and over, and typically that pattern ends in violence. So let's begin in verse 1. Now it happened in Iconium that they went together to the synagogue of the Jews, and so spoke that a great multitude, both of the Jews and of the Greeks, believed. So notice that pattern: synagogue, going there, initial reception. But there's the word of contrast. The unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brethren. So you've got the initial reception, and then you've got the eventual rejection. And it just goes to show how a few discontents can stir up others. And we see that pattern today. People who are discontented or non-believers or people who want to find fault can definitely pull others away from the truth. And so you have to always be mindful of that. Therefore, they stayed there a long time. So I think that's interesting that Paul and Barnabas were undaunted in staying here in Iconium. They're going to stay as long as they possibly can, but there's going to come to a point where they can no longer safely stay there. Speaking boldly in the Lord, they were undaunted. They continued to speak boldly. They had the gift of the Holy Spirit for sure, who was bearing witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. So they were doing some miracles, but remember, their mission wasn't about being miracle workers, but about preaching the gospel. That was just a tool that they had from the Holy Spirit that allowed them to do that. But the multitude of the city was divided. Part sided with the Jews and part with the apostles. Now, here that word apostles is being applied to Paul and Barnabas. And when a violent attempt was made by both the Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to abuse and stone them, they became aware of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding region. And they were preaching the gospel there. So again, the pattern: begin in the Sabbath, initial acceptance, eventual rejection, leads to violence, and leads to them moving on. The same thing happened at Pisidian Antioch that we saw in chapter 13. Now, we move on to Lystra, and in this city, we're going to see that there's going to be some misconception about who Paul and Barnabas are. So we're moving here eastward to Iconium, and then southward to Lystra, and then eastward again to the city of Derbe. Verse 8, and in Lystra a certain man without strength in his feet was sitting, a crippled from his mother's womb, who had never walked. This man heard Paul speaking. Paul, observing him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, stand up straight on your feet. And he leaped and walked. So this incident here is very much reminiscent of the miracles that Jesus would perform during his earthly ministry. So now Paul is doing this, and again, not as a miracle worker, and that is his sole purpose, but he's doing so that people in the city of Lystra might believe. That's always the purpose of biblical miracles, is to instill faith. Now, when the people saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." And notice here we're using a plurality indicating a polytheistic belief. Lowercase g, we're not talking about Jehovah God, not talking about Yahweh, the God of Israel. We're talking about Greek mythology, and perhaps you've studied Greek mythology in school. They're actually going to assign two Greek gods' names to Paul and Barnabas. To Paul, they're going to refer to him as Hermes. Hermes was the Greek god known as a messenger, so it would stand to reason, since Paul does most of the speaking, that he would be the messenger. And they're going to assign the identity of Zeus then to Barnabas. And Zeus had power and authority, and I suppose that Barnabas appeared as one having authority. Now, this is a misappropriation of a polytheistic culture onto what Paul and Barnabas are doing, and they're going to recognize it immediately as blasphemy. And Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. Then the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of their city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, intending to sacrifice with the multitudes. This is more than just a friendly reception of guests traveling into Lystra. This is idolatry, and this is blasphemy. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard this, they tore their clothes and ran in among the multitude, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men with the same nature as you, and preach to you what you should turn from these useless things to the living God, who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all the things that are in them, who in bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways." Now, they ripped their clothes. That's a sign of mourning, but it's also a Jewish traditional sign of blasphemy. When you recognize blasphemy, you rip your clothes as a sign of indignant outrage. And so they are angry with this and rip their clothes. Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And with these sayings, they could scarcely restrain the multitudes from sacrificing to them. Part of this is they want to give a friendly reception to the gods, because it was their belief that when Greek gods visited in mortal form, that they could take vengeance out on people if they did not receive them. And so part of that is out of that polytheistic notion of receiving the mortal form of a Greek god. Then, okay, so again, pattern. Initial reception at Lystra, then we're going to have an eventual rejection. It begins in verse 19. Then Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there. Okay, so they have followed Paul and Barnabas into the city of Lystra. And having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. However, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and went into the city. And the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. So we're moving them from Lystra to Derbe. Now, that sentence, that paragraph here, says a whole lot in just a few words. We are not given the gory details. This is a gory paragraph in Acts chapter 14. Paul is stoned nearly to death. He is so listless and lifeless that they make an assumption that he is dead. You can picture in your mind that he would have been bloody, dirty. Just imagine how painful it would be to have stones thrown at you and to be left for dead. Yet he gets up and carries on and perseveres, and he's going to continue to do the very thing, preaching the gospel, that caused him to be stoned. Now that's boldness and courage that they prayed for very early on. So I think that one paragraph there is very critical to understanding the nature of missionary journeys. We will pause there and pick up next week in verse 21 as we see them moving on from Derbe and going back. So you notice these arrows here on the graphic that I'm showing you on the screen. We end up at Derbe, then we're going to travel back and visit the cities that we came through. This again is another pattern. So we've established several patterns about Paul's missionary journeys, about going to the synagogue, initial reception by the Jews and the Gentiles, eventual rejection, and then a repeat of visiting cities that they had already passed through as part of their missionary journey. So I hope you have found today's midweek Bible study useful, and I look forward to worshiping with you on Sunday morning.